Booktube, it's Amy here again, and I have Fishers of Books open once again. Barton Curry's 1931 collection of chapters/essays on his experiences with book collecting. So yesterday I read chapter 1 and chapter 2, and now I'm skipping ahead quite a bit to about the middle of the book, where we have a chapter called Blessed Are the Various, which is about collecting and what a great thing it is that people have different tastes in books. So here on page 137, Curry writes, "Happily, no two strong-minded, hard-riding hobbyists can likely be found anywhere who would agree on any list or on any standardized guide to collecting. Were it not for this fact, book collecting would be a dull, matter-of-fact affair. Worse than that, we'd all be scrambling over one another's shoulders in quest of the same book. Someone would corner the market, and there would be nobody left in the game save the most recent crop of plutocrats with an international syndicate, Rosenbach, Wells, Maggs, Kordich, Francois, Baer, Olusky, and company, to supply them. Diversity of tastes is the greatest of all boons to collecting. Hence, when you get down to the task of choosing for yourself the 10, the 100, the 500, or the 10,000 books you desire to collect, you are bound to derive vastly more satisfaction than if you were to be guided by the recommendations of some individual whose judgment is sound, but whose taste may be at complete variance with your own." Just after propounding the above bit of wisdom, I wandered again into the fascinating bookshop of Leo Olusky on the Via del Babuino, Rome, and in the course of a delightfully brief 2 hours, obtained another vivid flash of understanding on the subject of diversity of tastes in old books and manuscripts. Into the Olusky shop, while I was there, came a Japanese gentleman, Mr. J. Oga of Osaka, who was collecting Dante and who had come to Rome to supervise the printing of a catalogue of his collection in the Italian language. He was followed by the head of a New York City engineering firm in quest of old Italian and Latin works on engineering. Next, I was introduced to a New England banker buying ancient account books and ledgers. In these huge parchment volumes, the bookkeepers before and during the Renaissance had recorded divers international business transactions that involve the currency and rates of exchange of a score of nations, kingdoms, principalities, dukedoms, free cities, and trading corporations that employed currencies of their own. Here was a specialized field that I had hitherto been unaware of, yet I was informed that there were collectors the world over who paid extraordinarily high prices for medieval account books, and that some of their collections included specimens of ancient Chinese and Egyptian bookkeeping. While the New England banker was bargaining for a huge leather-bound ledger that carried the accounts of a Florentine merchant from 1503 to 1505, and which had remained in the possession of the descendants of that merchant until a few days before, there entered the shop an elderly lady from New York, whose special mania was collecting 15th and 16th century books on lace making. She was just in time to find a little book illustrated with woodcuts that had been made in Venice in 1523. Soon after she had departed, there arrived a fussy little bald-headed man from Chicago, who said he represented a woman collector who was interested only in illustrated books on fans. There was nothing in his line at Olusky's, so he went on his way after having obtained a list of Neapolitan bookshops. Next, my attention was directed to 2 bearded Germans, who collected as a team. Their specialty was old maps, and they brought with them their own bibliographies. They were still mapping, as my wife calls it, when we left the shop. These were not all. Among other visitants in that one day were Italian collectors who went for Tasso and Petrarch, a tall, lean, impressive-looking Jewish gentleman from Cairo, who was said to have one of the most important collections of Hebrew manuscripts in the world, and a youngish-looking French savant who sought only early Italian disquisitions on philology. And so you will find it in every important rare bookshop throughout civilization. We who follow the poets and novelists and great essayists are dumbfounded to come upon collectors who manifest a zeal equal to our own in searching out old works on the early navigators of the Mediterranean, others who confine themselves to the early Norse seamen, still others who seek exclusively rare documents about the first Eastern voyagers. In the same broad category, we find those who gather geographies and maps, beginning with Anaxamander's first map of the world about 560 BC and following down to the present. This last is a costly hobby if you remove the breaks, as I discovered in glancing through the catalogue of Francis Edwards of 83 High Street, Marylebone, London, entitled Old Maps of the World, New Series No. 3, £1,300 for the Atlantic Neptune, published for the use of the Royal Navy of the Great Britain by Joseph F. W. DeBars, Esquire, under the direction of the Right Honourable the Lords Commissioners of the Admiralty. True, it contains 140 large-scale sheets of charts of the Nova Scotian and New England coast, made before our rebellion against the bad manners and stupidity of George III and his ministers. It is described as a magnificent copy in the original state, 2 volumes, Imperial Folio, 1780 to 81. But £1,300, and this only a minor item if you are filling up a general library with that sort of thing. In the same catalogue, I noticed a Christopher Saxton atlas of English and Welsh county maps, 1574 to 1579, for £300. A 10th edition of Mercator's Atlas of the World, printed by Henry Houdinus at Amsterdam in 1633 for £200, and a 1649 Joan Ballou Atlas of Holland for £600. And so it goes, eating up thousands of pounds before you have made more than a beginning with any of the major rarities. Among collectors of rare and precious bindings, another distinct class, you will find the princely sort who go in only for jeweled and carved ivory bindings of the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries, others who narrow down their choices to Gruyère and Maioli bindings, a few who only want mosaic bindings, an occasional one or two who must have early Gothic bindings in carved wood. Then there are collectors of armorial buildings who might be particularized as the family history crowd. They trace their lineage back to early kings and emperors and collect exclusively among these bloodlines. There are many such on the continent, and they want no bindings, books, or manuscripts that fail to articulate somehow with their glorious ancestry. These might be called the most individualistic of all specialists and the most trifling, though it does happen that their libraries sometimes contain great treasures. An heirloom first edition, for instance. Occasionally you meet collectors who will have nothing in their library save the products of the Eldine Press. They would turn up their noses at the exquisite publications of Jenson or the best of the cradle books of the earliest Florentine printers, though you will find Jenson fanatics with equally closed minds. For generations, England had its Caxton followers, men who scorned Wyneken, De Worde, and Pinison, just as today one finds worshippers of Bruce Rogers who have a low regard for the output of the Shakespeare Head and the Nonsuch Press. To proceed with subdivisions, there are garners of 15th and 16th century woodcuts, and the few remaining collectors of microscopic books, who begin with John Taylor's Thumb Bible, and fill whole cabinets with the Laputan examples of stunt printing, which to the general run of bibliophiles represent the last word of futility. Collectors of illustrated books are as greatly diversified in their preferences as are any of the other groups, some specializing in the earliest of old vellum books, which were illuminated in monasteries, some confining their selections to the supreme examples of 20th century illustration, the rest running the gamut of fields in between. Nor may we leave out the collectors of sporting books and the collectors of sporting prints, the collectors of playbills and the collectors of clippings that record the dramatic criticism of several centuries. We have also specialists in bibliographical books, in books of heraldry, in theological works, a field by itself with infinite ramifications. Then come to mind the collectors of autographs and the collectors of ancient manuscripts, beginning with the Egyptologists, continuing through with the specialists in Hebrew, Coptic, Sanskrit, Chaldean, Chinese, Persian, and later manuscripts, and concluding at long last with the collectors of the holograph documents of Ramsay MacDonald and Herbert Hoover. It is rather generally known that there are specialists in Frankliana, Washingtonia, Jeffersonian, Sonia, I don't even know how you pronounce that. It's the names of American presidents, but he's added Oniania onto the end. But he's got Franklin, Washington, Jefferson, Jackson, Lincoln, and Roosevelt, and Wilson, which is that ending that you would have on Americana or Canadiana. And for some reason, it is tripping up my tongue when I try to pronounce that with those presidents' names. But moving on. The assembling of Americana is becoming one of the most attractive of all specialities, and is offering to dealers everywhere a golden opportunity. If you could happen upon a complete file of first issues of Ben Franklin's Poor Richard's Almanac, such as the Curtis Publishing Company presented to the University of Pennsylvania 20 years ago, you would have a treasure as valuable as the finest first folio of Shakespeare extant. For sundry collectors' specialities not already told off, read down the columns that append. And so there are several pages here of lists, and I won't put you through these pages of lists, but we've got things like religion, the law, sociology, navies, armies, biology, finance, banking, paleontology, geology, ethnology, physical training, athletics, nothingology, common sensiology. And then he says, these columns have stretched out far enough to include all the ologies of science and pseudoscience, all the graphs and all the cultures and the arts and the humanities, will give the appearance of a gross exaggeration of the possibilities of specialized bibliomania, though it would nevertheless be capable of proof. So for some inexplicable reason, I left out the list altogether. Mathematics and literature, reading and writing, journalism and publishing, plumbing and carpentry, cabinet making and steam fitting. But why go on? A definitive enumeration would crowd all the other text out of my book. And there's a footnote here where he says, if you must have farther amplifications of the possibilities, by all means buy The Anatomy of Bibliomania by Holbrook Jackson, London, Masonico Press, Volume 1, 1930, Volume 2, 1931. And so it goes on to say, I shall ask each reader to round up the list to his or her, by the way, I failed to include either feminism or universal suffrage, satisfaction. Do not overlook the fact that many subjects unthought of today will be added as the years go on. Wherefore, no thinkable sort of faddist need be excluded from the wide open preserve that invite all manners and sorts of fishers of books, be they exclusivists or generalists, philandophers or frenetics. The specialists sometimes delude themselves with the idea that they are in the majority. But I say unto them that for each and every specialist there are at least 10 bibliomaniacs, just as reckless and raging, who collect more or less on the hit or miss plan, who merely scout and rummage for rare books and manuscripts of whatever sort the passion of the moment inclines them towards. They may have begun as specialists, but they are not made of that sterner stuff that enables one to adhere to a single objective. Or it may have been that the hobby which enticed them into the game ramified into other zones of interest and led them off into unforeseen and divergent byways. As one of my fellow collectors shrewdly observes, it is difficult to hold a good maniac down to a solitary author or a single subject once his bibliomadness is in full ramp. He may begin as the worker bee in the hive and go through all the motions of mechanical patience and industry. But as the obsession grows, he will one day, with alarming suddenness, become a bumblebee collector, wander all over the map, and gather his honey indiscriminately. No one will ever disabuse me of the conviction that bumblebee collectors are the happiest of all, for I am one of them. Limited though my experience may be, it is sufficient to persuade me that I could never have reached my present high state of exaltation by following my original plan of confining myself to Dickens. The greatest of English storytellers had been my favorite during my mature reading years, and there had been a time when I could recite whole pages from Pickwick. There were entire chapters of Martin Chuzzlewit that I knew almost by heart. There was no scintilla of doubt in my mind that I loved Dickens and could always go back to him with keen enjoyment. So it was I sized up my reading affections when I first yielded to the consuming frenzy of bibliomania. Dickens first, then Conrad. I had become a Conrad addict with the first appearance of Elmer's Folly, purchasing altogether by accident a first American edition of his first work. During my expensive novitiate as a collector, however, it never occurred to me to mix Conrad with Dickens. Conrad was still alive, and at least one new novel of his was appearing every year. In those primitive days, I had the absurd notion that the only works of the dead In those primitive days, I had the absurd notion that only the works of the dead were worth a real collector's regard. The moderns were for those who merely dabbled at collecting and feared to risk more than a pittance on what they were not sure of, even as a pastime. The inevitable obsession of the novice is that he alone has seen the divine light and launched upon a noble hobby in a noble way. Then the great author of Lord Jim passed on, and Rosenbach tempted me with the manuscript of Typhoon, only a short time before he had sold to me the copy of Pickwick that Dickens had presented to Hans Christian Andersen, and on that occasion I had boasted to him that I was one of the few collectors who collected on a plan. I was a Dickens man and would stick to Dickens. Rosenbach admitted that that was the ideal way, but added that the plan had certain drawbacks. I'm just going to pause here to show you Curry's copy, a facsimile, I guess, of the title page of Curry's copy of the Pickwick Club with the inscription "From Dickens to Hans Christian Andersen." So that's that there. So the plan had certain drawbacks. And, that's an interesting question. Are you a worker bee with one motive in mind? Are you adhering to the plan, or are you a bumblebee going here and there? I am, although I wouldn't call myself a serious collector in the vein that Barton Curry would suggest when it comes to the books that I collect. And I don't think a book has to have particular value for it to be something that you can say that you have collected. A book collection doesn't need to have value for it to be a collection. But in my own collecting, I am definitely more of a bumblebee, so to speak. I am not collecting one author. I collect and I read, as I've said before, on a whim. But Curry goes on to write, you would never have a generally interesting library as a result. What you had to show would interest Dickens collectors only. Still, he agreed, Dickens would always be sought, and the prices of rare Dickens items would continue to mount month after month and year after year, a statement emphatically borne out some years later when a presentation copy of A Tale of Two Cities brought more than $10,000 at the current sale, or 5 times what I paid for Hans Christian Andersen's copy of Pickwick. But about the manuscript of Conrad's Typhoon, as I have said, I was zealously committed to Dickens, knew what I was doing and knew I was right, yet Typhoon was an example of Conrad's genius I delighted in. I had been somewhat of a sailor early in life and loved the sea. I considered Typhoon a great bit of writing. As an editor of magazines with vast circulations, I was interested in manuscripts, typescripts, proof sheets, and everything that had to do with printer's ink. It gave me a positive thrill to turn over the page that Conrad had written in that big, sprawling hand of his. Yes, I bought the Typhoon script, and that was the end of my great resolve to stick to a one-author plan. I not only bought Typhoon, but later on added the manuscripts of Victory Folk and half a dozen short stories. I managed to find and buy the typescript of Typhoon. I acquired a complete lot of Conrad first editions, including a presentation copy of the rare 1913 Chance. And here we have manuscript and typescript of Typhoon. So there is the manuscript that he purchased, which sent him off his one author plan into a two author plan and eventually into more of a Bumblebee style. So then he writes, and having once broken away from Dickens, I was soon swept out into the cross currents of happy-go-lucky collecting. I kept on buying Dickens and will never lose my interest in him, but I will never be known as the authority on Dickens or as a great Dickens collector. Having gone forward to Conrad, it occurs to me that one day that I might as well go back to the genesis of novel writing and buy Richardson. So I began with a very fine copy of Pamela, and having acquired Pamela, I sought all the other Richardsons and have them. So this causes me to pause. I admit my ignorance here. I have no idea who Richardson is or what Pamela is. I can only, guess from this passage that Pamela was the first, or at least one of the early examples of a novel published in the English language. But either way, Curry thought that a copy of Pamela was worth collecting, and so his collecting diverged from there. He says, I then branched out to Fielding and acquired a most worthy first of Tom Jones in the original calf, then all the rest of Fielding's novels and some of his plays. Another point of ignorance, I have never read Fielding. I've never read Tom Jones, although I, of course, heard of him. Then he says, I plunged on to a first Robinson Crusoe and on to a first English Don Quixote. I haven't read Don Quixote yet either. I followed on up into the 19th century and got together a commendable lot of Jane Austens, a few Brontes, several presentation Brownings, and a few fine Shelleys, a dozen rare Cruikshanks, and a fairly representative shelf of Lewis Carroll. But enough. I have provided sufficient evidence against myself to demonstrate that I was capable of following no consistent plan, that I gave my hobby the bit and allowed it to lure me into all manner of odd bypaths. Can I do better than offer myself as a horrible example of haphazard book collecting and then attempt to point out my objective? If I can induce you to follow an opposite course, I may succeed in accomplishing some good for the cause of bibliomania. That, I feel, is a worthy aim, and my heart is in it. Having slipped and stumbled so many times, I have bruises to show and scars to point. You are likely to have more faith in a confessing sinner than in a saint who lays an impressive finger on his breastbone and then announces in a deep, solemn bass, I am the faultless one, I stumble not, neither do I swerve. Follow my knowing heels, and you will become wise in the eyes of all men. I have never far to go to find a better planned collection than mine. The supposed worth of a collection in dollars and cents matters little as against the personal satisfaction you get out of it, and the longer the period of your devotion, the greater the satisfaction derived. In the spring of 1927, I went out to Cleveland, Ohio, to see Mr. Paul Lemperley's collection. I had often heard about his books from others, and I had talked to him about them at one of A. Edward Newton's delightful Sunday afternoon teas. Mr. Lemperley is one of those collectors who has unfalteringly confined himself to the collection of moderns. He bought first editions fresh from the press over a period of 50 years, chiefly the work of novelists, and with what uncanny foresight he picked his men. He has a complete lot of Thomas Hardy that is as fresh and as new as when it came from the binders. The pristine condition of his desperate remedies and the virginity of his pair of blue eyes should not make any hardy collector squirm with envy. But it is not only the condition of his books that is so hard to bear. He sent to the publisher for them as they were coming out, and paid the publication price plus a pittance of duty. And on top of that, he read each of them, wrapped it up in cotton, and sent it back to England to the author with the request that he write a few words on the flyleaf. Of course, he mentioned how greatly he admired all Hardy's works and how he'd enjoy the particular book. Few writers can resist this sort of spontaneous enthusiasm, and Hardy and many others Mr. Lemperley wrote to were not of them. They replied charmingly and added 1,000% or so to the value of those editions. It was in the case of Stevenson, Meredith, Barrie, Kipling, George Moore, and certain others. It is a signal achievement to pick a great author at the very beginning of his career and to collect him item by item as everything from his pen appears in print. To do this on a wholesale scale, as Mr. Lemperley has done, is more than an achievement, it is magic. After spending almost an entire day in his library, I could discover no instance where, from the collector's viewpoint, his judgment had gone astray, save only my very personal view in the case of Conrad. With Conrad, he did not seem to have followed through with sufficient zeal. But he picked H.M. Tomlinson, even before the critics had recognized him, and obtained for 10 shillings or thereabout a superfine first of The Sea and the Jungle. A few weeks after it appeared. After reading the book, he sent it back to the author with one of his enchanting letters, and thereby won an inscription that is uniquely rare and valuable to any lover of Tomlinson. I recall crowing before my visit to Mr. Lemperley over my as-new copy of The Sea and the Jungle with dust wrappers, which I had found for $50. Lemperley's copy is worth 3 of mine and cost him approximately $5. There were literally hundreds of beautiful and very valuable books in his library, which he bought at publishers' prices. Less than half of his entire collection had been purchased from dealers, and $150, he told me, was the most he had ever spent on any book, letter, or bit of manuscript. Before I left, he graciously gave me a little pamphlet, one of an edition of 27, privately printed for him, in which he published for the first time a letter Thomas Hardy had written to Jeanette Gilder defending Jude the Obscure. I could have sold that pamphlet the day after to a Chicago dealer for $50. Paul Lemperley's most extraordinary adventure in collecting was probably his purchase from an outdoor bookstall of 3 paper-covered first editions of Stephen Crane's Maggie for 75 cents. He gave away 2 of these copies and has refused $1,000 for the one still in his possession. I feel wholly justified in indicating that Mr. Paul Lemperley of Cleveland, Ohio, as a golden example for the book collector to follow. He was a man only moderately well off, who was neither a scholar nor a critic, who had no contacts with the world of literature or with the world of publishing, and whose reading was almost exclusively for the purpose of recreation. 9 out of 10 books that he read were novels, and he paid scant reference to current book criticisms. Indeed, at the beginning he relied more on publishers' announcements than on anything he read in the book reviews. But once having picked his man and having found satisfaction in that first book purchased, he followed that author year after year as he might a friend to whom he was greatly devoted. Surely this is an ideal method of collecting. Likewise, the most economical way of all. Pick only the great, and pick them while they are vivid beings in the flesh, to whom you may write and from whom you may expect a gracious response. All you should require to succeed is a little special witchcraft and a vast amount of patience. Yes, and one thing more, a gift for writing letters that charm and hypnotize authors. Without this peculiar gift for correspondence, you will not succeed with many modern authors, certainly not with Bernard Shaw, nor with several others of the famous, who have expressed their annoyance and amazement at the prices being paid in New York and London for their letters. I write this with a bit of a twinge, as I tried Shaw myself not long ago and met with a frigid response. I had bought a letter of his, written early in his career, which mentioned by name a publisher I was unfamiliar with. I wrote to ask him for a word of enlightenment, and made the fatal mistake of mentioning that I had a collection of Shaw's first editions, many of his letters, and some of his manuscripts. The crafty playwright saw through my guile at first wink. Another of those American imbeciles, he probably said to his secretary, trying to fish for a letter and then sell it to Gabriel Wells or Rosenbach. Look up what he wants to know, type the reply, and send your own name. Whether or not these were Shaw's exact instructions, his lady secretary did just that, conveying the desired information to me in 2 cold, formal lines. I was so disgusted that I tore the letter up and cast it into the scrap basket. On another occasion, however, when I concealed my... Oh, I'll pause here because we have a facsimile of a letter here. A great Shaw to Barrie Association item now in the W.T.H. Howe collection. So this is a letter from Shaw, Bernard Shaw, to Barrie. And I'm going on the assumption that when he says Barrie, he's indeed talking of J.M. Barrie, my very own J.M. Barrie, an author that I collect, certainly not in first editions because I am a poor 25-year-old. Let's see what we were at. On another occasion, however, when I concealed my identity as a book collector, I did fish forth a Shaw letter at the cost of a 3 halfpenny stamp. I was playing the role of editor of World's Work at the time and persuaded Evie Lucas to write Shaw a letter stating that I would appreciate a chance to talk to him about writing for that magazine. I failed to obtain the interview but hooked this letter, which would have a current market value of about $50. And there is the copy of the letter. And I admit I find it difficult to read these cursive letters that are included in this book. And unfortunately, Curry does not, as often happens in modern books, provide a transcription of the letter. And so reading this, we are literally left with trying to discern the cursive. But I can give it a try here. This authentic copy of the first edition of Vachel Begin's Profession. I probably got that wrong. It would probably help if I actually knew, the names of his plays. Reprinted from the type used in the something. Oh. I had an alarm going off on my phone. There's something to say in which it first... It doesn't help that this is extremely small printing. Appeared as a serial I dedicate to W.O.D. Peterson of Stratford, who has sent me a $1 bill. If every collector of autographs in the United States would do the same at the present state of exchange, I should be a millionaire. Most of them send me only 2 cents American postage stamps, which are not negotiable in this country. A good deal of the old Paine dialogue in this edition is worth reading nowadays by people who have a sense of literary humor. I can't read that, that's far too small. It's something... Oh, it seems incredible that I should have written it 33 years ago without any sense of its absurdity. But it really was not so absurd then. Ladies of a something did not talk like Sir Walter Scott's heroines. So I roughly made it through that. As I said, the handwriting is very small, and I am a member of the last generation to learn cursive in school, and I don't have much occasion to read cursive, so I sometimes find it a little bit on the difficult side. So Curry says he failed to obtain the interview, but he hooked this letter, which should have a value of $50. And then he has just transcribed another letter here. Dear sir, not even to oblige Lucas can I waste your time pretending that there is the smallest chance of my undertaking any journalistic work or any extra literary work of any kind just now. You all forgot how old I am. I should have been glad of the job 50 years ago. Faithfully, George Bernard Shaw. And that is a letter directly to Curry regarding that article. Although Shaw is probably the most prolific letter writer of his generation, no one should reproach him for dodging correspondence, particularly when he suspects a collector's wiles. I know how authors and prize fighters and cinema idols are badgered for autographs and letters, and as a collector I am all for men of genius who write the fewest possible number of letters, if I happen to possess any of their correspondence at least. So that is the end of that chapter, Blessed Are the Various. I hope you enjoyed that, and I think I will read maybe 1 or 2 more chapters from this, so sort of stay tuned for that, I suppose. I hope you're all having a lovely Easter Sunday.